What mysteries lie hidden in the silence beyond the mortal veil, where breath ceases and the soul stands bare? Can a single glimpse of divinity unravel the tapestry of a lifetime's belief, weaving a new truth in its place? When the radiance of eternity calls your name, will you dare to answer or cling to the shadows of the known? What if the love you sought all your days was waiting in a form you had never imagined, a truth you had once denied? And when the Creator's voice pierces your heart, will you have the courage to surrender to its boundless embrace? In the heart of a devout soul, a sacred journey unfolds. From the embers of unwavering faith, a divine light emerges, illuminating the path to eternity. The hospital room is a cold, sterile chamber, its air heavy with the sharp scent of antiseptic, a bitter tang that clings to the throat like a whispered warning. Machines hum and beep in a relentless rhythm, their mechanical pulses a stark contrast to the faltering heartbeat they monitor, each sound a thread in the tapestry of impending fate. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh, unyielding glow, their unnatural sheen reflecting off the pale faces of those who wait their breaths. Shallow, their eyes clouded with unspoken dread. Beyond the window, the night presses close, a vast, inky shroud that seems to hold its breath as if the stars themselves await a divine decree in the stillness. Are you ready to face a truth so vast it could unravel the very essence of all you hold dear, leaving you bare before the infinite? O ye who listen, heed this sacred chronicle of a soul standing at the threshold of eternity, where the echoes of a devout life met the whisper of a divine revelation, and the veil between worlds was torn asunder, revealing a light that would forever change its course. In the heart of a bustling city, where the call to prayer wove through the air like a sacred thread, Ahmed lived a life steeped in the teachings of Islam. Born into a family where faith was not merely a part of existence, but the very foundation upon which all was built. He walked each day in devotion to the Almighty, his heart a sanctuary for the words of the Quran. 5 times daily, Ahmed knelt in prayer, his forehead touching the earth in humble submission, his lips reciting the verses of the Quran with a reverence that stirred his soul. The mosque was his refuge, its walls a fortress against the chaos of the world, its minaret a beacon that called him to communion with Allah. Each step within its sacred halls, each whispered prayer, felt like a step closer to the divine, a connection that anchored him in a world of uncertainty. Ahmed took pride in his piety, believing with unshakable certainty that his dedication to the teachings of Islam would lead him to the gates of eternal salvation. His life was a rhythm of sacred rituals, a dance of faith that gave him purpose, a melody of devotion that resonated in his very being. He fasted during Ramadan with unwavering discipline, his body a vessel of sacrifice, his spirit lifted by the closeness to God that fasting brought. The Quran was the compass of his existence, its words a guiding star in the darkness of life's uncertainties. Ahmed studied the hadiths with meticulous care, memorizing the surahs that spoke of divine mercy and justice, seeking answers to the mysteries of existence through Islamic scholarship. To him, this was the straight path, the one true way to Allah, as the Quran had promised, a path he walked with conviction, with the certainty that it would lead him to paradise. As a child, Ahmed had sat at his father's feet, listening to stories of the Prophet Muhammad, his heart swelling with awe at the tales of compassion and wisdom. His mother taught him to recite the Quran, her voice a gentle guide, her hands steady as she pointed to each sacred verse. Those early lessons had rooted deep within him, shaping a man who saw the world through the lens of his faith, a man who believed that every action, every prayer, was a step toward divine favor. Ahmed's days were filled with acts of devotion. He gave alms to the poor with a generous heart, his hands outstretched to those in need. Seeing in their faces the reflection of God's creation, he visited the sick, his words a balm to their suffering, his presence a reminder of the mercy of Allah. In every deed, he sought to embody the principles of Islam, to live a life that would please his Creator, to earn a place in the gardens of paradise. Yet even in the fortress of his faith, shadows of doubt crept in unseen but persistent, like whispers in the stillness of the night, late in the hours of solitude. When the city slept and the stars bore witness, Ahmed would lie awake, his mind wrestling with questions he dared not voice aloud. The Quran spoke of the day of judgment, where deeds would be weighed on the scales of divine justice, a balance that would determine his fate. But what if his efforts fell short? What if, despite his countless prayers, his endless fasting, his tireless charity, his sins tipped the balance against him? What if he stood before Allah, his good deeds too few, his heart too heavy, with the weight of human imperfection? These thoughts were fleeting, quickly buried beneath the weight of prayer and study. But they lingered, a faint shadow cast across the light of his faith. Ahmed had always respected the beliefs of others, his curiosity as a student of theology leading him to explore beyond the boundaries of Islam. He found Christianity particularly intriguing, yet deeply flawed in his eyes. The notion that Jesus could be the Son of God seemed to him an affront to the oneness of Allah, a concept as absurd as it was blasphemous, a doctrine that contradicted the very foundation of his faith. To Ahmed, Jesus was a prophet, revered and honored, a man chosen by God to deliver his message, but a man nonetheless, like Moses, like Abraham, like Muhammad. The Trinity was a mystery he could not fathom, a doctrine that defied the simplicity of Tawhid, the oneness of God that anchored his belief. How could God be three, yet one? The idea seemed to fracture the divine unity he held sacred, a puzzle he could not solve, a belief he could not accept. And the idea of salvation through grace alone felt like a hollow promise, a shortcut that diminished the value of effort. The sacred struggle to live righteously in Islam. Salvation was a balance, a lifetime of deeds weighed against sins, a journey of striving to be worthy of Allah's mercy. The Christian notion of grace, of forgiveness without effort, seemed to undermine the very principles Ahmed had lived by, the principles that gave his life meaning. For years, Ahmed carried this conviction, a shield against the teachings of Christianity. He debated with Christians at every chance, his arguments sharp as a blade, his knowledge of the Quran a fortress of logic. He quoted verses with precision, pointing to what he saw as contradictions in the Bible, dismantling their beliefs with clarity and strength. His faith felt unshakable, a rock upon which he stood, and he took pride in defending Islam, in upholding the truth he had always known. But beneath this certainty, the quiet doubts remained, a whisper in the depths of his soul, a question that refused to be silenced. What if there was more to the truth? A light beyond the teachings he had known? What if the divine was greater, more boundless than he had ever imagined? What if the path he walked, though straight, was not the only way to God? Ahmed's life was a tapestry of devotion, each thread a prayer, each knot an act of charity, each color a moment of worship. He taught children at the mosque, his voice patient as he guided them through the Quran, his heart swelling with pride as they recited the verses he had once learned. He led prayers during Eid, his voice rising above the congregation, a melody of faith that united them in worship. He visited his grandparents' graves, placing flowers upon the earth, whispering prayers for their souls, feeling the weight of their legacy in his heart. He sat with his siblings late into the night, discussing the mysteries of faith, their voices a chorus of shared belief, their laughter a bond forged by love and devotion. Ahmed's life was one of purpose, of certainty, of faith. But the shadow of doubt, though small, was ever present. It was on a journey to visit his family in a distant city where the air was thick with the scent of jasmine that Ahmed's world began to unravel. The day dawned with the serenity of routine. The Fajr prayer whispered in the pre-dawn stillness, its verses of familiar comfort on his lips, a ritual that grounded him in the sacred. He spent the morning with his younger brother, their voices rising and falling in passionate debate, discussing the nature of God, the path to salvation, the meaning of righteousness. Ahmed's words were fervent, his belief a flame that burned brightly, his heart alive with the conviction of his faith. His brother listened, his eyes alight with curiosity, his questions a mirror to Ahmed's own unspoken doubts. They spoke of the prophets, of the miracles that shaped their faith, of the mercy of Allah that guided their lives. Ahmed recounted the story of the night journey, when the prophet Muhammad ascended to the heavens, a tale that filled him with awe, a reminder of the divine connection between man and God. His brother smiled, his faith a reflection of Ahmed's own, their bond a testament to the family that had raised them. As the afternoon sun climbed high, casting golden rays through the window, a shadow fell upon Ahmed, a discomfort in his chest. Subtle at first, a whisper of unease he dismissed as nothing more than fatigue. He had been traveling, he reasoned. Perhaps he was simply tired, his body in need of rest after the long journey. But as the hours passed, that whisper grew into a roar, a sharp stabbing pain that clawed at his lungs. Each breath a struggle, each heartbeat a battle against an unseen foe. The pain was unlike anything he had known, a fire that burned within him, a weight that pressed upon his chest, threatening to crush the life from his body. Ahmed, we're going to the hospital. His brother's voice cut through the haze of pain, firm and unyielding, his hands already reaching for the keys, his face etched with worry. Ahmed protested, his pride resisting his voice, weak but defiant. It's merely indigestion. I'll be fine. But the pain did not relent, its grip tightening with every passing moment, a relentless force that drained the strength from his limbs. His brother would not be swayed, his love for Ahmed stronger than any protest. And soon they were in the car, racing through the city streets, the world outside a blur of color and sound. By the time they reached the emergency room, Ahmed could scarcely stand, his body trembling, his vision swimming with the weight of his suffering. The doctors moved swiftly, their faces a mask of urgency, their hands a blur as they ran tests. Each result deepening the gravity in their eyes, each word a hammer against Ahmed's fading hope. Within the hour, Ahmed lay on a hospital bed, machines tethered to his body, their wires a lifeline to a world he felt slipping away. The doctors spoke in hushed tones, their words a storm in his mind. You're experiencing a severe heart attack. A heart attack. At his age, the thought was a tempest of disbelief, a wave that crashed against the shores of his understanding. He had always cared for himself, eating with mindfulness, exercising with discipline, praying with devotion, his body a temple for the worship of Allah. How could this be his fate? How could his life, so carefully lived, be brought to this precipice? The question swirled in his mind, a whirlwind of fear and confusion, each one a dagger in his heart. As the doctors worked to stabilize him, a wave of fear crashed over Ahmed. Unlike anything he had ever known, he thought of his family, of his parents whose faces he longed to see, of his siblings whose laughter he yearned to hear, of the prayers he had yet to offer, the deeds he had yet to do. Was this the end? Was he to meet his Creator, unprepared, uncertain? With doubt still lingering in his heart, the thought was a weight upon his soul, a fear that threatened to consume him, a darkness that loomed ever closer. The room began to blur, the voices of the medical staff fading into a distant hum, their words a whisper against the storm within him. His chest felt as though it were being crushed, each breath a labor, each heartbeat a plea for mercy. He closed his eyes, whispering the Shahada, the declaration of faith over and over, desperate to cling to the one truth he had always believed would save him. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. The words were a lifeline, a thread of hope in the gathering darkness, a prayer that had guided him through every trial, a beacon that had illuminated his path. But the darkness enveloped him, a void of nothingness, no pain, no sound, no light, just an endless silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. Yet deep within that silence, Ahmed felt a stirring, a sense that this was not the end, that someone was waiting for him beyond the veil. The darkness shifted, a faint trace of anticipation threading through the void, as though he stood on the edge of a vast unknown journey, a path that would lead him to a truth he had never imagined. He knew with a certainty that transcended understanding that his life was about to change forever. When awareness returned, Ahmed found himself untethered, no longer bound to the frail vessel of his body, a sensation beyond the grasp of mortal words, like floating in a sea of weightlessness, yet with no form, no boundaries to define his existence. He looked down, and there on the hospital bed was his own body, pale and still surrounded by doctors and nurses working with frantic urgency. The machines beeped erratically, their shrill cries a stark contrast to the calm that enveloped Ahmed, their rhythm a desperate plea to call him back to life. His brother stood nearby, his face ashen, his hands gripping the edge of a chair. knuckles white with fear, eyes glistening with unshed tears, his lips moving in silent prayer, a plea to Allah to spare his brother's life. Ahmed should have felt panic, should have been overwhelmed by the sight of his own body, lifeless and frail, but instead a strange peace washed over him, a serenity that defied the chaos below. It was as though he were watching a scene from a distant memory, a moment detached from his own existence, a play unfolding on a stage he no longer belonged to. He tried to speak, to call out to his brother, to assure him he was still here, that he had not left, but no sound came. No voice to bridge the chasm between worlds. He wasn't sure he even had a voice in this form. Wasn't sure what he was, a soul, a spirit, a fragment of consciousness caught between realms. Was he dead? The thought sent a shiver through his essence, a ripple of uncertainty in the stillness of his being. His faith had taught him of the afterlife, of the soul's journey to judgment, where deeds would be weighed and fate decided, a moment of reckoning before the throne of Allah. But this was not what he had envisioned. No angels of judgment, no scales of justice, no familiar scenes from the teachings of Islam, just him floating in a liminal space, caught between the known and the unknown, between life and what lay beyond. And then he saw it, a light not like any he had ever beheld, not harsh, not blinding, but radiant with an intensity that seemed to pierce the very fabric of existence. It pulsed softly, growing brighter with each moment, as though it were alive, a heartbeat of divine energy that resonated with the core of his being. The light was not of the hospital room, not of the mortal world, but from somewhere beyond, distant yet impossibly close, a realm that existed outside the boundaries of time and space. Ahmed felt its pull, a magnetic force that reached into the depths of his soul, drawing him with an irresistible call, a summons that spoke to the very essence of who he was. He hesitated, his instincts urging him to resist, to cling to the reality he knew, to the teachings that had guided his life. But the light was more than a vision, it was a presence, a living essence that spoke without words, its call a feeling so profound. It transcended language, transcended understanding. A call that felt like a return to a home he had never known. The room around him began to dissolve. The beeping of the machines, the voices of the doctors, the sight of his brother's tear-streaked face, all fading into nothingness, replaced by a vast, all-encompassing brightness that seemed to swallow the world. Ahmed felt himself pulled through a tunnel of light, the radiance growing closer, its warmth enveloping him like a mother's embrace, a comfort that eased the fear in his heart. At first he resisted, his mind clinging to the teachings of his faith, to the certainty of what he had always known, to the Quran's promise of the afterlife. But the pull was gentle yet undeniable, a loving invitation that could not be refused, a call that felt like the voice of God himself, though Ahmed could not yet name it as such. As he moved toward the light, a new sensation emerged, a warmth that was not of the body, but of the soul, a deep, penetrating warmth that filled every part of him, soothing the doubts that had plagued him, yet powerful in its magnitude, awe-inspiring in its divine essence. The light was not merely something to behold, it was something to feel, something alive, something that pulsed with the heartbeat of creation itself. Where am I going? The question echoed in his mind, but it felt small, insignificant in the presence of such majesty. Ahmed had been taught to trust in the Quran, to believe in the afterlife as it was written, a journey to judgment, a meeting with the angels of death, a reckoning before Allah. But this light, this experience did not fit the scriptures he had studied, did not align with the teachings he had lived by. Fear gripped him, a tremor of the unknown, a shadow that threatened to pull him back. What lay beyond this light? What truth awaited him? Was this a test, a trial of his faith, or something greater? Something he had never been prepared for. But another part of him, a deeper part, could not deny the truth of what he felt. The light was not merely a phenomenon, it was an invitation, a call to something divine, something that transcended all he had known. As he drew closer, the warmth grew stronger, and with it a peace unlike any he had known. Even in his most fervent prayers at the mosque, even in the quiet moments of fasting during Ramadan, even in the stillness of the night when he felt closest to Allah. This peace was complete, all-encompassing, as though every doubt, every fear, every burden had been stripped away, leaving only the purest essence of his soul. Yet beneath this serenity, Ahmed sensed a moment of reckoning, a turning point that would redefine his very existence. The light was not a destination. It was a doorway, a portal to a truth he had never imagined, a truth that would challenge all he had believed. He hesitated, hovering at the edge of the light, feeling unworthy, unprepared for what lay beyond. What awaited him? What divine truth would he face? Was he ready to step into the unknown, to surrender to a reality he could not yet comprehend? But the light seemed to answer its presence, a reassurance, a silent promise that he was not alone, a whisper of love that eased his fears. With a breath that was not of the body, Ahmed stepped into the light, and in that moment he knew everything was about to change. The warmth he had felt before now enveloped him fully, a cocoon of peace that was both overwhelming and humbling, a divine embrace that held him in its infinite love. The brightness was no longer mere light. It was alive, vibrant, pulsating with a power that transcended comprehension, a power that seemed to hold the universe in its grasp. Ahmed felt as though he stood in the presence of something infinite, something beyond the grasp of mortal understanding, a divine essence that filled him with awe, a presence that spoke of the Creator in a language beyond words. And then he saw him from the brilliance of the light. A figure emerged, radiating a presence so majestic, so powerful, that Ahmed was struck by a profound reverence, a feeling that brought him to his knees. Though he had no body in this realm, the figure stepped closer, and with each step, waves of love and compassion washed over Ahmed, not as mere emotions, but as the very essence of love itself, filling every corner of his being, healing every wound, illuminating every shadow. "Who are you?" Ahmed asked, his words small, inadequate in the enormity of the moment, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and fear. The figure looked at him, eyes that seemed to see through him, into his heart, his soul, every hidden doubt, every unspoken fear, every moment of his life laid bare before that gaze. The gaze was not condemning, not harsh, but deeply understanding, as though he knew Ahmed completely, knew every prayer, every deed, every moment of doubt, yet loved him without reservation, loved him with a love that was boundless, a love that was divine. "I am Jesus," he said, his voice a melody of divine authority, yet gentle as a whisper on the wind, a voice that seemed to hold the weight of eternity, yet offered the comfort of a father's embrace. The words struck Ahmed like a thunderbolt, his mind reeling, struggling to process the impossible, a storm of disbelief crashing against the shores of his faith. As a Muslim, he had revered Jesus as a prophet, a man of God, a messenger chosen to deliver divine truth, but never more. The idea that he could be the Son of God was a belief Ahmed had dismissed, debated against with fervor, rejected with all his heart, a doctrine he had seen as blasphemy, a contradiction to the oneness of Allah. "That cannot be," Ahmed whispered, more to himself than to the figure before him, his voice trembling with the weight of his disbelief. "You are a prophet, a man. How can this be?" Jesus smiled, a smile filled with patience, with kindness, a smile that seemed to hold the wisdom of eternity, a smile that spoke of a love that transcended all understanding. "You have many questions, Ahmed," he said, "and I am here to guide you to the answers." Before Ahmed could speak, before he could argue, before he could cling to the teachings that had defined his life, the world around them shifted, the light transforming into vivid scenes, as though time itself had opened its pages before him, revealing truths he had never dared to seek. First, he saw scenes he knew, stories from the Quran about Jesus, moments Ahmed had always accepted as truth, moments that had been part of his faith since childhood. He saw Jesus healing the sick, his hands gentle as a breeze, his touch a conduit of divine mercy, restoring health to those who had known only suffering. He saw him giving sight to the blind, their eyes alight with wonder, their voices raised in gratitude, their faces glowing with the joy of a miracle. He saw him raise the dead, a mother weeping as her son was returned to her, a miracle Ahmed had believed, but now witnessing it with his own eyes, the weight of it pressed upon him. A weight that spoke of a power beyond the mortal realm. The compassion in Jesus' touch, the authority in his voice was unlike anything Ahmed had ever imagined. A divine presence that resonated with the deepest parts of his soul. Then the scenes changed, revealing moments Ahmed recognized. Not from the Quran, but from the Bible, moments he had once dismissed as falsehoods, as stories tainted by human error. He saw Jesus at the Last Supper speaking to his disciples. His words a testament of love that transcended human understanding, a love that bound them together, a love that spoke of sacrifice and redemption. He saw him in the Garden of Gethsemane, his anguish palpable, his prayers a plea for strength, as he prepared to bear the weight of humanity's sins, his sweat like drops of blood, his heart heavy with the burden he would carry. And then Ahmed saw the crucifixion, a scene he could not turn away from, though every part of him ached to do so, though the sight pierced his heart with a pain he could not name. The nails driven through his hands and feet, the crown of thorns pressing into his brow, the pain etched into Jesus' face, all bore witness to a suffering beyond comprehension, a suffering that seemed to shake the heavens themselves. Yet even in that agony, Ahmed saw something more, a strength, a purpose, a love so profound, it defied the cruelty of the cross, a love that seemed to radiate from him even as the world turned dark around him. Why, Ahmed asked, his voice trembling with the weight of what he witnessed. Why did you do this? For you, Jesus replied, his voice steady, unwavering, for all of you. The words pierced Ahmed's heart, a truth so vast it threatened to unravel everything he had believed, a truth that spoke of a love he had never known, a love that bore the sins of the world, a love that offered redemption without price. In Islam, salvation was a balance. Good deeds weighed against sins, a lifetime of effort to earn divine favor, a journey of striving to be worthy of Allah's mercy. But here was Jesus speaking of a sacrifice, a love that bore the burden of humanity's failures, a gift Ahmed had never imagined, a gift that turned his understanding upside down. The scene shifted once more, revealing passages from the Quran and the Bible side by side, as though the two were threads of a single tapestry woven together by the hand of the divine Jesus, pointed to prophecies Ahmed had read countless times, yet never truly understood, verses that spoke of the Messiah, of a light to the nations, of a Savior who would bridge the chasm between man and God, verses Ahmed had interpreted through the lens of his faith, but now saw in a new light, and then he showed their fulfillment in the words of the Bible. Each prophecy a piece of a divine puzzle, each verse a testament to his identity, a testament to the truth Ahmed had denied. How could I not see this? Ahmed asked, his heart heavy with realization, his voice breaking with the weight of his blindness. How did I miss the truth? You were searching, Ahmed. Jesus said, his voice gentle as a breeze, and now you have found it. Tears streamed down Ahmed's face, the weight of the revelation pressing upon him, a storm of clarity amidst the upheaval of his beliefs, a clarity that felt both liberating and terrifying. The pieces of a puzzle he had struggled to solve for a lifetime were falling into place, each one a testament to a truth he could no longer deny, each one a step closer to the divine. There is more to see, Jesus said, his eyes filled with compassion, a compassion that seemed to hold Ahmed in its embrace. Will you come with me? Ahmed nodded, his mind still reeling, his heart a battlefield of doubt and wonder, his soul yearning for the truth that lay ahead. He did not know what awaited him, but he knew one thing. His life would never be the same, for he had seen the face of Jesus, and that vision had changed everything. Jesus extended his hand, and the world around them shifted once more, the light expanding, enveloping everything in its radiant embrace, a light that seemed to hold the universe in its glow. Ahmed felt a sudden weightlessness, as though he were being carried to a new realm, a place beyond the mortal veil, a place where the divine revealed itself in all its glory. He was not afraid, for he trusted Jesus, though the full scope of this trust was yet to unfold. Though the journey was only beginning, the first vision that greeted him was breathtaking. A realm of colors more vibrant than any he had known, shades that shimmered with a life of their own, each hue a song of divine creation, each color a testament to the beauty of God's handiwork. The air was alive with peace, with joy, with a harmony that resonated in Ahmed's soul, a harmony that felt like the music of the heavens, a melody that spoke of unity and love. There was no pain here, no suffering, no sadness, only love, pure and overwhelming, a love that seemed to flow like a river, touching every heart, binding every soul, in a tapestry of eternal bliss. In the distance, Ahmed saw people of every kind, their faces glowing with a joy that came from within, their laughter a melody that echoed through the realm, their eyes alight with the radiance of divine presence. They moved freely, embracing one another as though they had found completion, as though they had come home to the place they were always meant to be. Some sang hymns of praise, their voices a chorus that seemed to lift the very heavens. Others danced in celebration, their movements a testament to the freedom they had found. "This is heaven," Jesus said, his voice warm as the dawn. "This is what it means to be united with God." Ahmed could barely speak. The beauty of it all, a weight upon his heart, a weight that was not of sorrow, but of overwhelming joy. "It is perfect," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "This is what I have prayed for." "Is it not?" Jesus nodded. "It is the fulfillment of God's promise, but it is not earned by deeds alone. It is a gift given freely through faith." The words struck Ahmed like a thunderbolt, a truth that shook the foundations of his faith, a truth that challenged everything he had believed in Islam. Everything was a balance, good deeds outweighing bad prayers offered at the appointed times, fasting observed with precision, a lifetime of striving to be worthy of Allah's mercy. But here Jesus spoke of a gift, a salvation that could not be earned, only accepted, a gift that turned Ahmed's understanding upside down. "Grace," Ahmed said, his voice trembling with both confusion and hope. "What do you mean?" "Ahmed," Jesus replied, his tone gentle as a father's. "No one can earn perfection. No one can live without sin. No matter how they strive, God's love is not something to be earned. It is something to be accepted. That is why I gave my life for you, for everyone, so that through me you could be free." The words shattered Ahmed's understanding, a lifetime of striving, of praying, of fasting, of giving alms. Now seen in a new light, a light that revealed the true nature of God's love. Here in this place of perfect peace, he was being told that salvation was not about being worthy, but about trusting in Him, in Jesus, the Son of God, the Savior who had borne the sins of the world. Before Ahmed could fully grasp this truth, the scene shifted, the warmth and light fading, replaced by a cold, oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow all hope. The change was immediate, a weight pressing down on Ahmed's chest, the air thick with despair, heavy with the absence of light, a void that seemed to pull at his very soul. In the distance he heard cries, anguished, desperate, a chorus of souls lost in torment, their voices a lament that echoed through the darkness. "This is hell," Jesus said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "This is separation from God." The vision grew clearer, revealing figures in the shadows, their faces contorted in pain, their hands reaching out, searching for something, someone, but finding only emptiness, a void that offered no solace, no redemption. The despair was overwhelming, a darkness so profound it seemed to swallow all light, a void that pierced Ahmed's soul with a pain he could not name. He saw their eyes filled with regret, with longing, with a sorrow that seemed to stretch into eternity, a sorrow that spoke of choices made, of love rejected, of a gift refused. "Why?" Ahmed whispered, his voice barely audible, his heart breaking with the weight of their suffering. "Why do they suffer like this? They chose separation." Jesus replied, his tone a lament that seemed to echo through the darkness. "God's love is offered to everyone, but not everyone accepts it. Hell is not a place of God's wrath, it is the absence of His presence, the natural result of rejecting the gift of salvation." Ahmed could not look away. The suffering, the emptiness, more terrible than anything he had imagined, a reality that shook him to his core. Yet even in this darkness, he felt the love radiating from Jesus, a love that ached for every lost soul. a love that yearned for their return, a love that never ceased, even in the face of rejection. Do you understand now? Ahmed Jesus asked, his eyes meeting Ahmed's, a gaze that held both sorrow and hope. The choices you make in life matter, not because of what you can earn, but because of the relationship you choose with God. Tears streamed down Ahmed's face, the weight of the revelation pressing upon him, a truth that reshaped his very being, a truth that revealed the heart of God in a way he had never known. He had spent his life striving, praying, fasting, doing all he could to be worthy, to tip the scales of judgment in his favor. But here in the presence of Jesus, he saw that all God desired was his heart, his trust, his love. A relationship that transcended deeds, a connection that was the true path to salvation. Ahmed Jesus said, his voice soft but firm, "Will you accept my gift? Will you trust me to lead you to the Father?" Ahmed hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of the weight of the moment, the enormity of the choice before him. Everything he had believed, everything he had lived for was being called into question. A lifetime of faith now seen in a new light. But deep within, he knew the truth, felt it in every part of his being, a truth that had been revealed in the light, in the visions, in the presence of Jesus. Yes, he said at last, his voice breaking with emotion, "I trust you." The light around them grew brighter, warmer, and Ahmed felt a peace unlike any he had known, a freedom that lifted the burdens of his past, a freedom born of divine love, a freedom that felt like coming home. "There is more for you to do," Jesus said, his tone filled with purpose, a purpose that seemed to resonate in Ahmed's soul. "You must return and share what you have seen." "Return?" Ahmed asked, startled, his heart aching at the thought. "But I wish to stay here with you, in this place of peace." Jesus smiled, a smile both comforting and resolute, a smile that spoke of a love that would never leave him. "Your time here is not yet finished. There are people who need to hear your story. They need to know the truth of my love, the truth of God's grace." The light began to shift, a pull drawing Ahmed back to the world he had left behind, back to the life he had known. He did not want to go, his heart yearning to remain in this realm of light, to stay in the presence of Jesus, to bask in the peace of heaven. But he knew he must, for Jesus had given him a purpose, a mission he could not ignore, a calling that would define the rest of his days as the visions of heaven and hell faded. Jesus' final words echoed in his mind. "Go, Ahmed, share the truth. I will be with you always." When Ahmed opened his eyes, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room replaced the divine radiance he had just known. Their cold glow a stark contrast to the warmth of heaven. His chest burned with pain, a reminder of the body he had returned to. The sound of beeping machines filling the air, a relentless rhythm that grounded him in the mortal world. The sterile scent of antiseptic hit him, a bitter tang that seemed to pull him back to reality. A reality that felt foreign after the divine realm he had witnessed. He was back in his body, back in the world he thought he had left behind. A world that now seemed small, fragile. In the light of what he had seen, voices echoed around him, filled with urgency and relief. "He's back," a doctor exclaimed, his tone a mixture of shock and wonder, his hands still trembling from the intensity of the moment. Ahmed blinked, his vision blurry, struggling to focus on the figures moving around him, their faces a blur of concern and hope. His brother's face came into view, eyes wide with joy and disbelief, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Ahmed, can you hear me?" His voice trembled with emotion, his hands reaching for Ahmed's, gripping them tightly as though afraid to let go, afraid that Ahmed might slip away again. Ahmed nodded weakly, unable to find words, his mind still caught in the divine encounter, his heart still basking in the light of Jesus' presence. He had been in the presence of Jesus, had seen heaven and hell, had felt a love that transcended all understanding, had accepted a truth that reshaped his very being, and now he was here in a hospital bed, surrounded by those who could not fathom what he had experienced, their voices a distant echo against the memory of divine words. The doctors spoke in hurried tones, marveling at his sudden recovery, their voices a chorus of disbelief. "It's a miracle." One of them said, his hands still holding the chart that had moments ago declared Ahmed's fate uncertain. We thought we had lost him. His brother gripped his hand tighter, tears streaming down his face. Alhamdulillah, he whispered, you're alive. The word felt heavy, foreign for just moments ago, or what felt like moments in the timeless realm of the divine. Ahmed had stood in a place beyond this world, had seen the face of Jesus, had heard his voice, had accepted his call, had witnessed the eternal truths of heaven and hell. Now he was here in a body that felt fragile, in a world that seemed so small, so fleeting, in the light of what he had seen. For the first few hours, Ahmed spoke little. His family by his side, their relief a palpable presence in the room, their voices a constant hum of gratitude and concern. His mother sat beside him, her hands clasped in prayer, her eyes glistening with tears of joy, her voice soft as she whispered thanks to Allah for sparing her son. His father stood at the foot of the bed, his face a mask of stoic relief, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes betraying the fear he had felt. But within Ahmed a storm of emotions raged, a tempest that threatened to overwhelm him. What had he experienced? How could he reconcile it with the faith of his life, with the teachings that had guided him, with the beliefs that had defined him? Jesus was not merely a prophet. That much was clear. He was so much more the Son of God, the Savior, the embodiment of divine love. But what did that mean for Ahmed, for his family, for his community, for the faith he had lived by since childhood? The weight of it all pressed upon him, a burden too heavy to bear alone, a truth that both liberated and terrified him. He lay in the hospital bed, his body weak, his mind racing, his heart caught between two worlds, the mortal and the divine. Late that night, when the hospital was quiet and his family had gone to rest, their voices a fading echo in the halls, Ahmed stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the encounter. The light, the love, the visions of heaven and hell, and Jesus' words all vivid, all undeniable, as though they had been etched into his very soul. Yet fear gripped him, a shadow that loomed over the light of his revelation. What would happen if he spoke of this? His family devout and proud of their Islamic heritage. How would they react to a truth that challenged all they held dear? A truth that contradicted the teachings they had raised him with. Would they reject him, cast him out, see him as a traitor to their faith? The thought was a dagger in his heart, a fear that threatened to silence the truth he had been called to share. He closed his eyes, hoping for sleep, hoping for clarity. But instead he saw Jesus' face, kind, loving, patient, a face that seemed to hold the answers to all his questions. Go, Ahmed, share the truth. I will be with you always. The words both comforted and terrified him. A call he could not ignore, a purpose he must fulfill, a mission that would define the rest of his days. Over the days that followed, as his body slowly recovered, his strength returning with each passing hour, his mind remained restless, caught between the divine and the earthly, between the truth he had seen and the life he had known. He could not deny what he had witnessed, could not erase the visions of heaven and hell, could not silence the voice of Jesus that echoed in his heart. But he was not ready to speak. Not yet. Not until he understood. Not until he found the words to bridge the chasm between his past and this new truth. One afternoon, when he was alone in his hospital room, the sunlight streaming through the window, casting golden rays across the sterile white sheets, Ahmed reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he searched, uncertain where to begin, but driven by a need to understand, to find clarity in the storm of his thoughts. He read about Jesus, his teachings, his miracles, his sacrifice, words he had once dismissed as falsehoods, now alive with meaning, now resonating with the truth he had witnessed. For the first time in his life, he opened a Bible, its pages strange, almost forbidden. A book he had once seen as a distortion of divine truth, a collection of stories tainted by human hands. But as he read, the words leapt forth, speaking to his soul, connecting the prophecies of the Quran to the fulfillment in Jesus. Each verse a confirmation of the divine encounter. Each passage a bridge between the faith of his past and the truth of his present. The Bible was not merely a book, it was alive, a living testament to the love of God, a testament to the sacrifice of Jesus, a testament to the grace that Ahmed had experienced, passages he had overlooked in the Quran, Verses that had puzzled him as a child, now shone with clarity, each one a piece of the puzzle, each one a step closer to the truth he had been shown. But with every revelation, the weight of his decision grew, a burden that pressed upon his heart, a choice that loomed ever closer. He could not keep this truth to himself. Jesus had called him to share it, to bear witness to the love and grace he had experienced. But the thought filled him with dread, a fear that threatened to silence him. How would his family react, his community rooted in Islam, proud of their heritage? What would they think of his newfound faith, of his encounter with Jesus, of his acceptance of a truth they had been taught to reject? The question swirled in his mind, a storm that refused to abate, a tempest that threatened to drown him in its waves. One night, the burden became too much, a weight he could no longer carry alone, a truth he could no longer keep hidden. Ahmed knew he needed to confide in someone he trusted, someone who might understand, someone who might listen without judgment. His younger brother came to mind, a confidant through the years, a soul who had shared in Ahmed's journey of faith, a brother who loved him enough to hear him, even if he did not believe. With a trembling hand, Ahmed dialed his brother's number, his heart pounding as the call connected, his breath shallow with the weight of what he was about to say. Ahmed, is everything well? His brother's voice was laced with concern, a concern that spoke of the bond they shared, a bond forged by years of love and trust. No, Ahmed admitted, his voice shaking. I need to tell you something that happened when I was gone. A pause heavy with anticipation, a silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. Okay, his brother said at last, his tone cautious but open. What is it? As Ahmed prepared to speak, fear rose within him, a shadow that threatened to silence him, but the memory of Jesus' words steadied his heart. I will be with you always. He was not alone. This was just the beginning, a new chapter in a journey that would lead him to share the truth with the world. When Ahmed finally shared his story, it felt like stepping into a storm. Uncertain if he would emerge unscathed, uncertain if his words would be met with understanding or rejection, he began with his closest friend, Hassan, a man who had always been his confidant, a soul who had shared in Ahmed's journey of faith, a friend who had listened to his doubts, his questions, his struggles, with a heart open to understanding. Hassan Ahmed began, his voice hesitant, his hands trembling as he clutched the cup of tea they shared. I need to tell you something that happened in the hospital, something that changed everything. Hassan's eyes narrowed, concern etching his features, his brow furrowing with worry. You mean when we thought we'd lost you? When you had the heart attack? Ahmed nodded. Yes, but I didn't just lose consciousness. I went somewhere. I saw someone who revealed a truth I never imagined. Taking a deep breath, he recounted everything, the out-of-body experience, the light that called to him, the encounter with Jesus, the visions of heaven and hell, the words of grace and love that had reshaped his faith. He spoke of Jesus' compassion, of the love that radiated from him, of the visions that showed the truth of his sacrifice, of the choice Ahmed had made to trust him, to accept him as the Son of God, as the way to the Father. When he finished, a heavy silence fell. Hassan's face a storm of emotions, shock, disbelief, and a flicker of something deeper. A flicker of curiosity, a flicker of doubt in his own convictions. Ahmed Hassan said at last, his voice quiet but firm. You've always been a man of faith, a seeker of truth, a brother to me in every way. But this, it's hard to believe. Are you certain it wasn't a dream? A hallucination brought on by your condition? I've thought of that, Ahmed replied, his voice steady despite the trembling in his heart. But this was no dream. It was more real than anything I've known. I felt his presence, I saw heaven, I saw hell, and I know the truth. He spoke, a truth that transcends all I believed. Hassan looked away, struggling to process the words, his hands tightening around his cup, his eyes clouded with conflict. You're saying everything we've believed, everything we've lived by, isn't the whole truth. No, Ahmed said gently, I'm saying the truth is greater than we thought. Jesus is not merely a prophet, he is the Messiah, the way to God, the embodiment of his love. Hassan shook his head, his disbelief evident, his voice rising with the weight of his concern. Ahmed, this could ruin you if you speak of this publicly. You know how our community will react, how your family will react. You could lose everything. I know, Ahmed said, his voice steady, his heart resolute. But I cannot stay silent. I was shown the truth. How can I keep it hidden? How can I deny the love I've witnessed? Hassan did not respond, his silence a heavy weight between them, but Ahmed could see the conflict in his eyes. A part of him wanting to dismiss the story, to chalk it up to delirium, to the trauma of a near-death experience. But another part, the part that knew Ahmed's heart, was listening, considering, perhaps even questioning his own beliefs. Over the days that followed, Ahmed shared his story with others. Those he trusted, those who knew his heart. Each conversation a step into the unknown. Each word a risk he could not avoid. Some reacted with skepticism, their faces closed, their words sharp. You've been deceived. They said your mind played tricks on you. This is not the truth of Islam. Others were outright dismissive, unwilling to entertain the possibility of his encounter. Their voices cold, their eyes hard. You've strayed from the path. You've betrayed your faith. You've turned your back on Allah. The words cut deep, a dagger in Ahmed's heart, a wound that bled with the pain of rejection. But he pressed on, driven by the call he had received, by the truth he could not deny. But a few listened, their hearts open, their minds curious, asking questions that echoed Ahmed's own journey. Questions that spoke of a longing for truth, a longing for something greater. One was an elder from his community, a man of wisdom and gentleness, whose eyes had seen many years, whose heart had known many truths. When Ahmed shared his story, the elder did not interrupt, did not argue, but listened with a quiet intensity, his face a mask of contemplation. When Ahmed finished, the elder spoke, his voice soft but steady. Ahmed, truth has a way of finding us, even when we're not looking for it, even when it comes in a form we do not expect. Perhaps this is God's way of opening a new path for you, in a path you were meant to walk. His words gave Ahmed courage, a flicker of hope in the darkness of rejection, a reminder that even in the face of doubt, there were those who would listen, those who would seek the truth alongside him. If even one soul could see the sincerity in his heart, perhaps others would too. Perhaps the truth he had been called to share could take root in the hearts of others. Ahmed knew he could not stop. Jesus had called him to share the truth, and he felt a growing conviction to do so publicly. No matter the cost, no matter the consequences. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about his comfort. It was about Jesus, about the message of love and grace he had been entrusted with, a message that could change lives, a message that could lead others to the Father. One evening, Ahmed stood before a small gathering, family, friends, and a few curious strangers, his heart pounding, his hands trembling, but a steadying presence beside him, as though Jesus himself stood near his promise, a shield against the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. I know many will find this hard to believe. He began, his voice trembling but resolute, his eyes meeting those of his loved ones. But I must speak of what happened when I stood at the brink of death. When I crossed the veil between worlds, I encountered Jesus. He showed me the truth about God, about heaven, about hell, and about grace. A grace that transcends all I have known. He called me to share this with you, to bear witness to his love, to the truth of his sacrifice. The room fell silent, the weight of his words a heavy mantle, a silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. Ahmed saw a range of reactions, shock in his father's eyes, confusion in his mother's, curiosity in his brothers, and anger in the faces of some friends. But he pressed on, sharing every detail, every revelation, every truth he had learned, his voice steady, his heart open, his faith unwavering. He spoke of the light, of the warmth that filled him, of the visions that revealed the sacrifice of Jesus, of the choice he had made to trust him, to accept him as the Son of God, as the way to the Father. He spoke of heaven, of the peace and joy that awaited those who accepted God's love, and of hell, of the despair of those who rejected it. A warning and a promise woven together in the truth he had witnessed. When he finished, some left, their faces closed, their hearts unyielding, their footsteps a sharp echo in the quiet room. Others stayed, their expressions thoughtful, wrestling with the weight of his testimony, their eyes searching for answers in Ahmed's own. A few approached him, their voices soft, their questions tentative. "Do you truly believe this?" One man asked, his tone skeptical, yet open a flicker of curiosity in his gaze. "I don't merely believe it," Ahmed said, his voice steady, his heart full. "I know it. And I pray you'll seek the truth for yourself, for Jesus is waiting to meet you where you are over time." Ahmed found ways to bridge his past and his newfound faith. Speaking of shared values, love, compassion, devotion to God, values that transcended religion, values that spoke to the heart of humanity. He highlighted prophecies in the Quran, pointing to Jesus, showing how his message fulfilled the divine promise, not to tear down the faith of his upbringing, but to open hearts to a greater truth, a truth that completed the journey he had begun as a child. The more he shared, the more lives he touched. Some explored the Bible, their hands trembling as they turned its pages. Others questioned their rigid beliefs, their hearts opening to the possibility of grace. And through it all, Ahmed felt Jesus guiding him, giving him words, giving him strength, a presence that never left his side. The journey was not without challenge. His family struggled. His father's voice trembled with pain, his eyes clouded with anger and sorrow. "How could you say such things? We raised you in the teachings of Islam, to honor our faith, to live by the Quran. And now you speak of Jesus as the Son of God." "It's not rejection," Ahmed replied, his voice gentle, his heart breaking with the weight of his father's pain. "It's fulfillment. Jesus showed me the way to God, a way of love, a way of grace, a way that completes the path we've walked." His mother wept, her hands covering her face, her heart torn between her love for her son and the faith she had held all her life, a faith that now seemed at odds with the truth. Ahmed spoke, his siblings were divided, some dismissing his story outright, their voices sharp with rejection. "You've lost your way." They said, "You've been deceived by a dream." Others were quietly curious, their questions hesitant, their hearts torn between doubt and the love they held for their brother. Those moments were among the hardest Ahmed had ever faced. The fear of losing his family, a constant weight, a shadow that threatened to dim the light of his mission. But he prayed day and night for their hearts to open, for their understanding to grow, for the love of Jesus to touch them as it had touched him. A prayer that became his anchor, a prayer that sustained him through the storm. Amidst the rejection, Ahmed found a new family, a local church that welcomed him with open arms. Their warmth a balm to his wounds, their love a reflection of the grace he had experienced. They did not see him as a man who had left one faith for another, but as a brother in Christ, a soul found by the love of Jesus, a testimony to the power of God's grace. He connected with others, former Muslims, Christians with shared backgrounds, people from all walks of life who had encountered Jesus in profound ways. Their stories a mirror to his own, a reminder that he was not alone in this transformation, a reminder that God was working in the hearts of many, drawing them to the truth of his love. Their laughter filled his days. Their prayers lifted his spirit, their presence a testament to the family he had gained. Even as he faced the loss of the one he had known, as Ahmed continued to share his testimony, lives began to change. People who had once dismissed faith began to ask questions, their voices tentative, their hearts open to the possibility of something greater. Others who had been rigid in their beliefs began to consider the message of Jesus, their eyes alight with a curiosity they could not ignore, their hearts stirred by the love Ahmed spoke of. And some, like Ahmed, took the leap, accepting Jesus as their Savior, their faces glowing with the joy of redemption, their voices raised in praise to the one who had set them free. One of the most powerful moments came when his younger brother, who had initially dismissed Ahmed's story, came to him late one night, his footsteps soft against the tiled floor, his face a mixture of doubt and longing. "Ahmed," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've been thinking of your words, of Jesus, of the grace you spoke of. I don't know if I believe it yet, but I want to learn more. I want to understand what you found." Tears filled Ahmed's eyes, his heart swelling with hope. "That's all I ask," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Seek the truth. Jesus will meet you where you are as he met me." Ahmed used his journey to build bridges between Islam and Christianity. Speaking of shared values, love, compassion, devotion to God, values that transcended the boundaries of religion, values that spoke to the heart of humanity. He highlighted prophecies in the Quran pointing to Jesus, showing how his message fulfilled the divine promise, how the two faiths were connected in ways many had never considered, how the truth he had found was not a rejection, but a completion of the journey he had begun as a child. But he also made it clear that the message of Jesus went beyond religion. It was about relationship, a personal connection with God made possible through his sacrifice, through his love, through his grace, a grace that surpassed anything Ahmed had ever known, a grace that had set him free. Looking back, Ahmed saw how God had used every part of his life, his upbringing in a devout family, his years of studying the Quran, his moments of doubt, his struggles to understand, to prepare him for this mission, a mission to share the truth of Jesus, to bear witness to the love that had changed him. The journey was not easy. Each rejection a wound, each harsh word a weight, each moment of doubt a shadow. But the joy of lives transformed, the hope of hearts opened, the love of Jesus that sustained him, outweighed every trial, every hardship, every tear. As Ahmed closed this chapter of his story, he spoke to those who would listen, his voice a testament to the truth he had found. Seeking truth takes courage. It means being willing to question all you've known, to step into the unknown, to trust that God will guide you. But I promise you this, it is worth it. For in the light of Jesus, you will find a love that never fails, a grace that never ends, a peace that surpasses all understanding. If Ahmed's story has touched your heart, if you feel a stirring within your soul, he encourages you to seek Jesus, to open your heart to him, to let him meet you where you are. For he is waiting with a love that knows no bounds, with a grace that can transform your life as it transformed Ahmed's. A love that will lead you to the Father, to the eternal light unveiled.